try to visualize what this land would have looked like before 1797 when Samuel Highway came here and established the town of Waynesville, I think we'd have to realize, of course, that it was much different. There was very little settlement here before 1797, and there were several reasons for that. One, we had no way of purchasing the land. Two, we had no government for the land. And three, of course, we still had conflicts with the American natives that were here at the time. There were several events that occurred quickly that changed that whole situation to where we could have settlement. In 1763, we had the Treaty of Paris ending the French and Indian Wars, which ceded the land to the English and took all French claims away. Then, of course, we had the American Revolution, which ended the British claim to the land and made it totally an American property. The Ordinance of 1785 and the Ordinance of 1787 provided a means for purchasing the land and a government for the land. This allowed Judge John Cleves Sims to purchase over 300,000 acres from the American government, and from him Samuel Highway purchased 30,000 acres in which he established Waynesville. Samuel Highway came here in 1792 and surveyed in this area. He established a pre-established cabin that is still in existence today, and established the town of Waynesville.
I read in the '06 homecoming edition about the story that when the highway colony arrived in Waynesville, which of course it was just a wilderness, no town, when they arrived here, that there was one squatter in the area. That squatter happened to be on these premises. The story they tell in the '06 edition of the homecoming is that the squatter had cleared a patch of ground prepared for burning and so on, but he moved on, decided to go further west. The next year or so, James Jennings arrived on the scene, and the people in Waynesville, there was about 15 families that arrived here in 1797, suggested that he should go out to the northeast of town and settle on some land that had been cleared by a squatter. But from all descriptions, it was in this area or beyond me that the original squatter had actually made a clearing, and it mentioned that in a way he had provisions that he fed the colony the first year of their existence here in Waynesville.
Reverend James Smith traveled to Waynesville in October of 1797, just 6 months after the town was settled, and he wrote in his diary these words: "This little town is situated on the western bank of the Little Miami. The lots are sold to none but actual settlers, and though it was only settled last spring, about 14 families are already here. They have the advantages of good air, good water, and good land. They are also on an equality. Pride and slavery are equally strangers. We are lodged here with a Mr. Highway, an immigrant from England. It was curious to see their elegant furniture and silver plate glittering in a small, smoky cabin. Reverend James Smith visited Waynesville, went back home to Virginia, and purchased 2,000 acres of land just south of Waynesville from Samuel Highway. He came back with his entire family, and with his wife Elizabeth founded the Methodist Church in Waynesville. The first church there was on the corner of Elbin Road and Waynesville Road, and later it was moved to Corwin, where Corwin is now, at the home of their daughter, Elizabeth Good. The Methodists went on to continue their presence in Waynesville with a church first on what then was Water Street, and then built a new church on the site of the present Methodist Church in Waynesville. The Good family donated a large portion of their farm to the Methodist Church in 1833 to be used as a cemetery. Their daughter Narcissus had died and was buried on their property. This site eventually became the Miami Cemetery in 1866 when it went public, and of course is still there today as our Miami Cemetery. Another group, the Quakers, of course, came to Waynesville early in our history and established a church here by 1803. All of this mainly because of the stress on non-slavery.
The Quakers left South Carolina as a protest, South Carolina and North Carolina, as a protest against slavery. They moved to Waynesville, where it was a free state, where there were no slaves. Moved up to Waynesville starting in 1800. There was a great migration in 1803, just before the meeting was founded. 1809, there was enough Quakers here that they'd started a quarterly meeting, which enabled them to build this meeting house here. This was built for the quarterly meeting. So Miami monthly meetings area was from Hocking River to the boundaries were Hocking River to the east and the Ohio River to the south, and no boundaries to the north and west. But they started laying off meetings from Miami meeting in 1807. First was West Branch and Fairfield and Caesars Creek and so on. Meetings that are west of the Allegheny Mountains can trace their roots back to Miami monthly meeting. This was the center of the Quakers at that time. In 1828, there was a schism in Quakerism, and it hit here in Waynesville. It was about who Jesus was and some of the direct word from the Bible versus the word from God. So they split into two groups called the Hicksite and the Orthodox. The Orthodox, being the smaller of the group, after they split, moved over to the log cabin, which was still standing. The Hicksites continued to meet here and still meet here as to today, but the Hicksites are now called Friends General Conference. The Orthodox in 1836 built the red brick meeting house, which is across the street, after the log meeting house became in such disrepair, and plus it wasn't big enough for their group. This was one of the only places in the world where a church has split into two groups and yet were able to coexist right across the street, this close to each other. They used to trade dishes during when one would have a quarterly meeting. They'd use the other one's dishes to accommodate the large number, and then vice versa. They would bring the silver and the dishes over here when the Hicksites had quarterly meetings.
The Furness family, which I am seventh generation Quaker, came to Waynesville in 1797 and started a Quaker meeting in 1803. They built a log cabin. Before that, they met in homes, and then they built the white brick, as we know it, in 1811, and it's still in operation.
The impact of the Quakers coming to Waynesville was the following of the testimonies of the Quakers, the integrity, they always told the truth, they never lied. The peace testimony, setting up the Underground Railroad, the honesty of the stores would not haggle with you. They also worked very hard for women's rights. Women always had the right to be a minister of a friend's meeting.
And every first day, which was Sunday, we would go to meeting, first day school and meeting, and then on Wednesday nights we always had Bible study at the meeting house. And the whole family would come. We lived 5 miles out of town, and it seemed like we come to town quite a bit. And we never missed a meeting. We all came. When you were little, you had to, but just knew you had to, but as you got older, you wanted to. When you were little, we had a clock in the meeting house that ticked all the time. And when you were little, it was like a confessional, because when that would tick and it was very quiet in there, you thought of all the little things you had done wrong that you promised yourself you would never do again. So it was very good, very good, very good life. We had a very good life.
The Friends were very, very prominent in education. Education is one of the foremost testimonies of the Friends. They believe in fine schools. Everyone should go to school. They opened the school system here in Waynesville back in 1803 when they started the meeting house. It was a schoolhouse during the week and then the meeting house during the year. And when they built this meeting house, they built a separate school building in 1811. The schools continued to be here in Waynesville until they started the public schools, which were consolidated in the 1870s, and then the Friends laid down the school.
And it was so important that the Quaker parents sent their children, especially the girls, off to college. I think that's something that most people don't realize. And also that the women were equal. They were just as much of a part of the family finances and everything as the men. It was an equally shared project.
The graveyard was started in 1804. It's one of the first graveyards in Warren County. The people were buried as they died. There was no family plots. You were just buried in row 1, spot 1, row 2, spot 1, until the graveyard was filled up. And it remains today in the same order. Caesars Creek meeting, when it first started, was Robert Furness, who is my great-great-great-great-grandfather. He sat at the head of that meeting from when it was started until 1860 when he died. On the Cook side, I live in the same house that my great-great-great-grandfather built in 1803. We've always farmed that. Since 1803, it's been in the hands of the Cooks. We have a deed that is signed by Thomas Jefferson as president.
Our whole family worked on the farm. We couldn't take outside jobs because there was too much to do. We had chickens and hogs and turkeys and sheep and raised grain. The best time on the farm is when we made maple syrup. And they'd been making maple syrup in the same pans, I think, for 150 years. And we would go out and collect all the sugar water from the maple trees, bring it in and boil it for hours and then drain it until we had maple syrup. And then we had 7 pans that they cooked it in, great big long pans. And when we were all through for the day, my mother would bring out steaks and put on the hot fire and put the potatoes in the fire. So that was a big time.
I'm Earl Earnhardt. I'm a member of the Alvin Earnhardt family. I had 2 brothers. My mother was Rachel Sheehan, I was born in this community, the Waynesville community, grew up there. And I graduated from high school there in 1939. My wife and I started going together in 1940, late 39. 1941 we were married. We started farming on the first day of January 1942. My mother was a birthright Quaker, and her mother was Annie Shin. And I attended the white brick church with her a couple of times. I remember how they had church, what it consisted of. I'm interested in history and things that relate to old times because of my age, I guess. The older I get, the more I realize how important the way our ancestors had to live, the hardships they endured.
Oh, my great-grandfather came here in 1860, and we've been here ever since. I left the farm in 1950 to go to college, and then I came back in 57 and farmed for 2 years, and then I left and went back to college. And then I came back in 79. I got married the second time in 78, and then my brother died in 79. I came back and started farming again. I've been here since 79. My brother had beef cattle. We kept a small herd. I've built it back up to 50 head now, 32 cows and 12 small ones, and I got 5 on feed right now.
The Miami Monthly Meeting of Friends, also known as the Quakers, in the early 1900s started giving thought to a retirement home or a retirement place for Quakers who lived out in the county. So in 1904 they started construction. They had authorized the Fox brothers out of Cincinnati to start and build the building. They did about $1,000 worth of work and went bankrupt. They decided they wanted to continue to go ahead with the building, so Aaron B. Chandler, who was a Quaker and a farmer, he decided he wanted to go ahead and be what we today would call the general contractor. He took care of all the building parts of it. They went ahead with the construction. The house opened in 1905, minus the front porch. The house itself is 3 stories, including an attic. It has a 40-foot by 40-foot area. We have 16 boarders rooms in it, and it opened with a full staff. The staff included Aaron B. Chandler originally as a superintendent. They had a full-time matron. She did the daily business. They had a full-time cook, full-time laundress, full-time housekeeper, and a gentleman who took care of the livestock because they were pretty self-sufficient up here. The house opened with the first visitor. She was Mary Terrell out of Xenia. There were 16 boarders rooms. The smaller of the boarders rooms cost $3.50 a week. For $3.50 a week, you were given your room, your laundry, housekeeping, and all your meals. The meals were done in formal setting. They were served 3 meals a day on fine china, linen napkins, just pretty much the whole yard. They had a very loving, very open, and very friendly atmosphere here at the home. And if you were a retired Quaker and you had come in from farming, whether you were a widow or a widower, it had to have been very nice because you had everything done for you here, and the house was considered a modern marvel. It had its own electric. It had a phone service here. It had, well, the electric was turned on in the evening and it was turned off again in the morning because Waynesville had their own power plant and they had no reason to leave it on during the day. So they did have electric here. They had indoor-outdoor plumbing, which was kind of unheard of at the time in 1900 and 1905. So it was a quaint, happy family atmosphere here. It also served the single teachers that worked in the area, particularly at the school across the street. teachers around here were single white women mostly. They were receiving their teacher certificate at the National Normal School in Lebanon, and then they would live here during the week and teach at the schools, particularly the one across the street, but Waynesville also had one-room schoolhouses at the time. So they would teach during the week and then go home to their family farms on the weekend.
I went to the friend's home with Grandmother Shin several times to visit different people that she knew that lived there. Among those, two ladies that I distinctly remember, Chandler girls. The Chandler girls were in residence at friend's home, and I visited my grandmother. Of course, I was quite young then.
The friend's home was there, where it is now, on 4th Street, across from the school. And as a child, I remember going over there and these elderly ladies teaching me how to play cards, and I would spend hours over there with them. We didn't have the nursing home at that time, but this was people that could take care of themselves mainly. And it was a wonderful, wonderful place, as I understand. They grew a garden in the back. They had chickens. They had fresh meat all the time and homemade breads and pies. And so it wasn't a bad place to have to go when you had to go there.
The museum started about 1999. There were a group of people here in Waynesville who felt that we were losing our heritage, when we were losing our local history. And most of these people were getting elderly in age, and they knew that once the history was gone, it would be gone. So they got together, they started the museum, they did all the legal paperwork to make us a 501(c) organization, and we were able to procure the Friends home as our home for the museum. We did this because once our history is gone, and we have a few instances around here that the villages are gone and there's no history left on these places. The small community of New Burlington, for example, is gone. It disappeared when the lake, Caesars Creek Lake, went in 1976. So for people that have never been there or didn't live there, they don't even know that that little village existed, and those people were vital. They were part of the community, and we want to make sure that everyone knows they were there.
We had a Grange Hall down on Main Street. It's just right on Main Street, just above the supermarket. So the building is still there, but we lost that after I went to college. I'm the only active member in Farmers Grange. Warren County had about half of the early Granges right here in Warren County. So Warren County really started the Grange movement. Our number is 13, but we had over half the first 15 Granges were in Warren County. But we only have 3 Granges left. I'm the only active member in Farmers Grange, and then Lebanon has lost their meeting place. So we're all meeting in Mason Grange now. The Grange Secretary's record book, this particular one says Farmers Grange number 13, May 1st, 71 through May 4th, 1978. So I have quite a number of these. Oh, here's my name. I joined in 47. I had all 7 degrees in one year. And, they met at Columbus, Ohio in 47, and so I had the 7th degree in Columbus. They filled the Ohio Theater 3 times. Here's my father, Charles, and he joined in 07, Mary in 27. See, that's the year they got married.
This is the Lytle room. Lytle was founded in 1883 by Alexander Ray and was originally called Raysville. It is now called Lytle. It was a small village on the west side of the Waynesville area. It was interesting enough that it did have a train that came down from Dayton Unfortunately, when they built the train through Lytle, they built no round table or a way for it to turn around. So when it came to Lytle, it would have to back up all the way to Dayton.
My family come to Ohio in the early 1800s. Great-grandfather Jacob come in here in approximately 1810 with his wife, Patient Wright, was her maiden name. She was from South Carolina and he was from Bucks County, Pennsylvania. And they had a son named John, and John was born in Raysville, which was the former name for Lytle. And that's what it says on his birth certificate, born at Raysville, Ohio. Around 1830 to 1832, he got the farm out here where I live now. There's approximately 600 acres in the originally old farm. It was wetlands, and they drained it, and it's all completely tillable now.
So the Clarks have been on this farm ever since Ohio was settled as a state, and they owned this, and they also owned several properties here and around Lytle. In fact, they own next east of us here. The next farm was his uncle's farm. So there were just the two boys. There was Walter and Wilbur, and Wilbur owned the one over there. He's the one that sold the farm and went to Lytle.
Walter then had a son, which was my dad, named Walter Clark, and the farm was handed down to Walter and a sister, Wanda Channel, and that brings us up to the present date. I was born next door, and then when Wanda went to nursing home, I bought the other half of the farm. And then starting around 1970, I started buying back part of the original farm, and I got 270 some acres of the original 600 acres bought back.
Original farmhouse that where Mike and Peg live now, and they tore it down and put his house up there. But it was a big two-story house, and I had lived with Walter's folks in downstairs, and then we built the upstairs and finished it all, so we had an apartment upstairs. And then when Wanda was his sister-in-law was so active in nursing My Valley Hospital in Dayton, her and her husband, when they retired, they came back down to the farm, and they tore the old house down and built a new house. And of course, when I first came, Lytle had a big, I wouldn't say a big, but it had an elevator over there where they sold the produce that the farmers raised, the corn for the birds. It had a grocery store, and in fact, when I first came, there were two grocery stores. There was the one on the corner across from the church, and then there was one in the middle of Lytle. And the one on the corner next to the church was Jones's grocery store, and the one in the center was a George Cussenborder, and they lived there for years. And of course, I went to Lytle Church for many years. The children were all members of the Lytle Church, and Mike and Beverly were baptized there. And later on, Mike and Peggy were married there in the Lytle Church.
About my work, it's something I enjoy. Every day is a little different. The livestock all left by the 60s. And basically, I just changed it into basically a grain farm. And on this home farm, all we grow anymore is corn and soybeans. We have to store our grain. Everything is built in to storing our grain and selling it in January, February, March. That's when we get a higher price than harvest. So I've transitioned the farm into totally grain.
Corwin room. Corwin is kind of the sister village to Waynesville. Corwin has always had the train station, the hotels, general stores, brick-making plants, and things like that. It also had the Miami Cemetery. The Miami Cemetery was laid out and designed by Leopold Welz, who was the master gardener to the Tsar of Russia. It was started in 1833. In 1865, President Abraham Lincoln's death train came through Corwin and stopped to take on water on its way back to Springfield. The cemetery itself, if you can see by the picture up there, is laid out very much like a park. At one time it had every native tree and plant, and Corwin had very vibrant activity that went on over there. Very wonderful people, hardworking. Like I said, they were more of the business or manufacturing aspects of our community, where Waynesville had the millinery shops and the banks. Corwin was more of the manufacturing.
When he came in, they called the town Farmersville, and then they decided, or they heard that there's another Farmersville also here in Ohio, so they changed the name from Farmersville to Corwin. And the reason of Corwin was that the governor of Ohio was Governor Corwin, and he came down several times when they was talking about the railroad, where the Little Miami Railroad executives had the meetings in the hotel over in Waynesville, and the governor came down several times, and since he was involved in it, they decided to call the town Corwin. On the railroad, this Johnson, he built the railroad through Corwin there, and then on both sides of the railroad, they had the business district and also residential. And then the town, they had they had a slaughterhouse, the lumber company, coal yards, had 1 to 2 hotels. They had a blacksmith, a livery stable, and it was a very thriving town. Also a depot and a post office. They had the Little Miami Railroad runs from Cincinnati to Xenia, and from Xenia it takes off to the Pennsylvania Railroad, which runs up to New York and Boston. It is to haul passengers and also freight. Another thing about the railroad, though, they had a lot of famous passengers come through Waynesville, and also they had there they had a water tower that would all the trains, the engines would stop there to take on the water. So they would stop there, and one of the famous persons came through was Abraham Lincoln, and he came through on his inauguration speech to go to Washington, D.C. He was in Cincinnati, but he was supposed to go through Dayton, but they had a word that there's an assassination plot against him there, so they rerouted him around, and he came through Corwin. And the train stopped at the water tower to get the water, and Abraham Lincoln came to the back of the train, and he gave a speech to the Corwinites there. They was real proud of that. Another time he came through was the funeral train there. And the railroad come through, and the railroad, the personnel on the railroad, the engineers, the conductors, and flagmen and all, they were so friendly with the people in Corwin, and the people in Corwin loved them so much that they all waved at each other. It was a big thing. And as the trains came through Waynesville, when they went through out in the country, which is all farm country, at that time the farmers never had watches, and the farmers would have their time by the sun and also by the railroad schedule of the railroads. That's how they would tell their times. And like I say, there was different businesses in Corwin there, but one was the Waynesville Lumber Company, and then there was W.W. Madden, his sister, and his brother came from Marysville, Ohio, down to Corwin. And Madden, he started the lumber company. That was in the 1905. And then his brother went over to Clarksville and started a lumber company. Mr. Madden had the lumber company till the 1940s, and that's when he passed away. But in the meantime, there was Fred Grauman. He worked for Mr. Madden, and in 1940, he brought the lumber company from Mr. Madden at the estate. And in 1960, I was working for a lumber company over in Middletown, and Fred Grumman came over and talked to me and told me that he's interested in finding someone to take over his lumber company. So we came over and looked at the company, and wife and I, we said, well, let's give it a try. And so I told Fred I'd work for him maybe a year or 2 years, and then tell him if I wanted to buy it or not. I did work for about a year and a half, and I decided to buy the company. So I bought the company from Fred, and I was the sole owner of it. It was a very active business way back in the time. Right now, today, we have about 5 or 6 different businesses there, and most of them was all family-owned operations like the lumber company.
William Harvey came to this area. He came up from North Carolina. They settled in Clinton County around the Springfield Quaker area, Friends Meeting area. Then he came over into Warren County and saw this parcel of land. It was owned at that time by Roden Ham, and that was in 1827. He bought enough ground that he platted it off into 47 lots, and that was the original Harveysburg. He said that he overlooked the valley and liked what he saw, and there was an S hill that came up from the creek up into Harveysburg. And Harveysburg was pretty well known as the village with the S hill. Dr. Harvey was also a medical doctor. So he was a doctor here before, and also then taught school. He set a seminary up over on Main Street, and then Elizabeth had classes teaching younger children in her home, and she was concerned that the black students or black children were not being educated. So they came back here on this street and built this building in 1831. And we think that it was a school until about 1909, when they were allowed then to integrate into the other school, the Massey Township School down on Main Street. And it was a dwelling then until 1976, when we were able to, well, actually purchased it in 1977 as one of our bicentennial projects, because we knew that it had a lot of history here, having been a black school. And we discovered that it's one of the first black schools in the state of Ohio, possibly the Northwest Territory. So it was a school from 1831 till about 1909. Talking about the Underground Railroad in Harveysburg, the Ashley House, it's called now, was a Harvey home, and it was an early house here, and we think that it was used as an Underground Railroad station. The legend has it that there was a tunnel that came up from the gully of Caesar Creek up to their home and allowed people to come and go without being noticed. There was one house where the Welches lived at one time, and some of the Harveys earlier, they found a Bible underneath the floor in the crawl space. And we wonder if maybe a slave maybe left that Bible there. We don't know how the Bible got there. So we know that the Quakers were sympathetic to the slave movement. And we had two Quaker churches here. The Grove meeting, the regular Quaker church at the corner of Clark and Maple Street. When they came into Harveysburg, they split, and the Hicksite Quakers met at the east end of town in a building there that they called the Hicksite Church. And there was a black slave that had run up here, a small person, and this person, I don't know whether it was a male or female, I think it was a girl, said that they were running after her, so she hid her under her skirts. And when the slave hunters came to the area to search for this person, they asked her if she saw a black person in the area, and she says, "I don't see a black person," which of course she couldn't see because he was hiding under her skirts.
I am sitting on the site of the original mill that was built here in 1806. The mill itself that Mr. Haynes had built had a fire and was partially destroyed, and so Mr. Haynes later sold this property to a man by the name of John Jennings. John Jennings built on this site a 3-story brick mill. Now the location of that mill was about probably 100 yards from where I'm sitting here. The footprint of the mill is still there. Going back to 1835, the old log dam on the Little Miami that creates the mill race behind me here, the log dam was replaced by a stone dam. The stone dam and masonry construction is still there to this day. It has had a little repair in the last 30-35 years and is in reasonably good shape. In 1904, Charles Robitzer bought the property from John Wright. Robitzer continued to operate the old mill until 1911. In that year, he discontinued the mill as a flouring mill. It was known through those years as the Waynesville Flouring Mill. In 1931, Mr. Robitzer built a very large swimming pool on this site. The old mill was still here. By this time, he had converted it to an ice plant. The ice plant operated until the 1950s. Mr. Robitzer also established a picnic grounds all around the area, practically where we are here today. It was known as Wayne Park. Mr. Robitzer renamed it Wayne Park, and it held that name up until he sold it to a Henry Geiger. Henry Geiger then renamed it Old Mill Stream. In 1952, Henry Geiger sold the property to Tom Norris and L.D. Baker. They started a fishing concession on the old mill stream that came through the mill, and it was very popular for people to come pay and fish. As a child growing up in this community, I was certainly used to coming to this site to go to the swimming pool. We here in Waynesville, as far as the children of Waynesville, were quite blessed with a very, very large swimming pool. In fact, in those years, if you went very far from home and you mentioned where you were from, inevitably people would say, "Oh, I have been there to the swimming pool."
They built a swimming pool in Waynesville, down by the old mill stream. And every night after we did all our work on the farm, the whole family, we would come to town and go swimming, and we'd be the only ones in that swimming pool every night.
We used to have a movie theater here in Waynesville, downtown Waynesville, right next to the what is currently the Hamill House. I believe there's an antique store. We had shows there 7 days a week, 2 shows a night. And there was about 3 different features a week. There was one for Saturday and Sunday, and perhaps Monday and Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday and Friday. So anyhow, I got 50 cents a night, and my job was to take the tickets and to change the coming attractions. I finally then got upgraded to the projection booth. Now, the projection booth was another interesting story, in as much as they were probably of about 1917, 18 vintage. They were actually built for silent movies. And they had carbon arc, and they adapted them with electronic eye and for the soundtrack. So now we were up to speed and modern with all the rest of the local people. We had sound movies, and on Saturday night it was a full house because Gene Autry and Tom Mix and all those locals from out west was really the thing to see.
Saturday night was a big night. Had open nights Mondays, Wednesdays, and Saturday, and all the stores stayed open until a grand hour of 11 o'clock. There was also 3 beer halls in the same block, and so that attracted a lot of people. Farmers brought in their eggs, and the kids went to the Twin Theater.
Oh, I'd go by and look at it. It cost too much. It cost 25 cents to go in and see the movie, and that was too much money. I was a little bit stingy.
In approximately the mid-40s, the women's temperance became very much aware of what was going on in Waynesville at the bars. And they would go to the churches on Sunday, and they worked on this until they got the beer joints closed. And since that time, there has never been liquor other than at the American Legion sold in Waynesville.
You know, Waynesville National Bank was founded in 1875, opened the door for business February the 1st, and operated as an independent bank. You know, it started on the southwest corner of North and Main Street, which is North and Main now, and has progressed. It went to the southeast or southwest corner of Main Street and North Street, and of course to its position where it's at now. After the fire in 1900, then they built the new building here in 1901. The fire on Main Street burnt down everything except 2 buildings on this side of the street where the current bank is located. The bank bought the corner property and built the new building. And I think the total cost was like $10,000 back in 1900, 1901. The bank put in its first drive-through window in 1962. Ross Hartsock was the president of the bank at that time, and he made the first deposit on horseback. In the 1930s, there was obviously a large volume of bank robberies and everything, so the nice ornamental steel cages came down and the bulletproof glass went up to protect the employees of the bank. The clocks on top of the bank, the tower clocks as we call them, which is a location point for anybody that wants to find anything in Waynesville, they tell you to go to the clock tower. They were put in 1972 as a tribute to George Riley, who was vice president of the bank in 1903 to 1929. Years ago, all the banks had their own currency printed. It actually bore the name of that institution. Here we have a $10 note that was drawn or issued by the Waynesville National Bank that hangs on the wall here. Actually, it's just a picture of it. I have the original locked up. The business district in Waynesville is pretty unique. You know, there were times when there were lots of empty buildings with all the malls and shops going in. The local department store closed, the local hardware store closed, and right now most of the businesses in town on Main Street at least are gift shops, specialty shops, and antique shops.
The Waynesville Chamber of Commerce was founded in 1969, and the first president was Don Hawk. And it was a very informal type of group. It was founded by local businessmen to work together and have a nucleus for promoting business. They have evolved. Originally, there were just the normal businesses that you see in a small town. And antiques were very much in vogue. There was an antique shop in every gas station and every grocery store, and we have developed a very interesting mix of stores now. It's just not antiques, but it's antiques and specialty shops. Waynesville Sauerkraut Festival, or it's called the Ohio Sauerkraut Festival officially, started in 1969. And it was started by a group of businessmen who wanted to have something to promote business in the village. And Cap Stubbs, who was a local businessman, said, well, last night I had a really great sauerkraut dinner. Why don't we start having sauerkraut dinners? And that's exactly how it started. But now we have a variety of foods, and of course we have regular customers that come every year just to be a part and eat the foods and see the vendors and see what's here. So it's probably the largest festival of its kind in Ohio, and we've done a little investigating. It may be among the largest in the country.
We bought the house in 1960. The problem was that the area flooded quite a bit from the Caesars Creek. So the Corps of Engineers from Louisville came up and they decided that there was a need for flood control. Also, there was a need for a water reservoir. They didn't develop any dams on the Little Miami, which connected to Caesars Creek about a mile below Waynesville. So what they did was to do a study, and they came up with the idea where they could put the dam, which would be located at the gorge, and as a result they would have to buy all the farmland and the small cottages that dotted along the river.
Back in, I think in the 30s, 32, in there somewhere, they had talked about making a lake here because the creek in the spring always flooded Morrow and some of the villages on down toward Cincinnati. So that was in the works back in the 30s, but then World War II came, and so of course that was put on the back burner and until after World War II was over.
You know, also the huge flood in 1936, I believe, in Cincinnati. This was going to help control the flood that would impact Cincinnati also.
The Corps of Engineers came in about 1972, purchasing all of the ground that was connected with the area that they wanted to flood, and of course they didn't want anyone building around the lake, so they purchased ground around the lake as well. They took some of the ground from Harveysburg in order to do that.
There were strawberry farms along the river that were hard to give up. There were the apple orchards, and of course everybody wants their own property to go down to their children.
We lived out on the Furnace Oglesby Road, and we did not think it would affect our land. Of course, I was grown up then. And one day my dad came home and said, "Mother, they're going to take our land also." And so the government bought them out, and they moved to town on Main Street, which was the best thing because my dad was still farming at the age of 79. The land is now used for camping for horse riders, and they bring their trailers in with their horses and they camp there and they cook there and then they go out on the trails, which I guess is very beneficial and a good thing to happen.
It started about 1960 and it continued for about a number of years. Each time the EPA would come in and say, no, you can't do that, and you have to do something different there. You couldn't take down log cabins because in process of these were historical structures. So at that time the Corps would have to stop and see what they could do to get rid of these log homes that were considered historical. So they would have to be moved or they would have to be numbered, pictures taken. So they approached a group of people in Waynesville and asked them if they would somehow form a historical society that would take care of these log buildings. So that's where the Waynesville Caesars Creek Pioneer Village started, because they took on the job of removing these historical structures, taking them up to Pioneer Village.
The idea of Pioneer Village started in the early 70s when the Corps of Engineers were clearing the property around here to build the Caesars Creek Dam and the Caesars Creek Lake State Park. They were about to tear the Levi Lucan's home down when they discovered under the clapboards there was a log cabin.
The original place was the Lucan's cabin. Now, the Lucan's cabin was the original site. The barn was there. The barn had been, the wood was taken off of it by different people to use in their homes. So all that had to be replaced. The building had to be gutted and the exterior framing taken off so they exposed the log cabins. And in the process, every time the Corps of Engineers found a log historic home, they asked the village people to get it moved. No money was involved. Property was just given to the village, and it was up to us to haul it, take it down, haul it out, and reconstruct it on the site that the Corps of Engineers had leased us. So our lease was originally for 25 years, and then it was extended.
And then the cabin that is the second one in the row here was found out on, it was Roxana, New Burlington Road, I believe, in Spring Valley. And it had to be moved. We had no idea how to move a log cabin, but we thought, well, we'll figure it out. And Mrs. Thelma Hatfield, who was an acquaintance of the Don Thompson of the Don Thompson Construction Company, talked them into loaning us some equipment.
And in the process, the village ended up with about 16 buildings that they redid, put up, and with Don Thompson helping out in his reconstruction crew. He was a builder out of Cincinnati. So he loaned us all his equipment and some of his foremen and some of his workers. And through that, we now have Caesars Creek Pioneer Village out there.